critically. So today we're going to examine the ways that different historians have tackled a really problematic issue, the rise of the West. So what do rise and West even mean in that phrase? Well, let's go to the thought bubble. So the West is a geographical designation, kind of. It means like Western Europe, North America, and Australia, which as you can see here are west of Asia and also east of Asia. In fact, everything is both east and west of everything else because it's a globe. But the West is also kind of a culture. It's a set of ideas influenced by Judeo-Christian thought and Greek philosophy with a little Enlightenment rationalism and Adam Smith's economics thrown in. Anyway, it's complicated, like all civilizations that span multiple continents, but most of you at least have an idea in your head when I talk about the West. And then there's the question of what we mean by rise when we talk about the rise of the West, which leads us back to the philosophical question of the nature of history itself. I mean, is history a series of rises and falls, like the story of the Roman Empire, or is it cyclical, like the Mandate of Heaven narrative that we saw when we looked at early Chinese history? So you could say, in fact, that the phrase itself, the rise of the West, is a little bit Western. The whole thing's a bit nebulous. And that makes it a popular subject for historians to tackle, because you can...
Welcome. We are going to be looking at some ideas that Hank Green presented in his little mini synopsis and crash course in world history. Good times, yeah. Well, first and foremost, we're going to go through 5 different historians. Their works range from 1998 to 2009, and we'll go through this. Also in that, there are 2 camps. There's a Eurocentric camp, and there's a non-Eurocentric camp. The non-Eurocentric camp, a lot of the players come from the California School of History, and I will tell you a little bit about that and some other things. So first, let's start with the first historian, which is, let me get my notes here for us, David Landis. David Landis, in 1998, wrote The Wealth of Poverty Nations, Why Some Are So Rich and Some Are So Poor. He basically predicates this whole thing on Europeans are special, and Asians were stuck in the 18th century. Europeans had something unique. This is also accentuated in Jones. Jones' first edition comes out in 1987, but he puts his 3rd edition out in 2003. Jones and Landis, specifically Jones, can be called Weberian. Mark Weber was a German sociologist theorist who articulated that because Europeans were Protestant, they had a specific niche work ethic, which made them more productive than other people on the globe, such as Africans or Asians. But we know that's not true, but he articulates that. So let's go into Jones's argument in his monograph or his book. Jones, the European Miracle, there it is right there, very Weberian. He talks about the economic long-term changes. Jones argues that because of certain fertility rates and the utilization of economics, that Europe was able to move forward, where Asia had higher fertility rates and had different economic practices, which created a divide. Both of these historians' arguments are Eurocentric, which came rise to the non-Eurocentric camp. The first person is Pomerantz and The Great Divergence. Pomerantz wrote his book in 2000, and this was really the movement into a non-Eurocentric camp, which has moved over the last decade and a half to discuss the rise of the West. And his book does a comparative approach of history between East Asia and Western Europe and discusses certain factors like crop production. But one thing he does argue, and somebody else will talk about later, is he talks about the utilization of coal and the breaking of, the reliance on wind and fire, wood. The English were the first to utilize this in a different way, whereas in China they use coal, but not to the same degree. After that, we would move into looking at Marx. Marx, The Origins of the Modern World. He talks about utilization of historical contingencies and conjunctures, where things come together and are contingent upon each other. His work frames off of Pomerantz and discusses coal, but he adds other arguments to the rise of the West, but he also holds in place a comparative approach with Asia too, staying in that kind of Pomerantzian view. Last but not least, we're going to be looking at Goldstone. Goldstone, someone critique him saying he is Weberian or Jonesist, but he's not. Goldstone talks about the rise of the West, and in there he talks about how, excuse me, I had to get my screen back on. Talks about the rise of the West and how there was something unique happening in England. There was some conjunctures with church, there was some contingencies based on Parliament, and the utilization of coal along with something else. Something I would like you to think about in this whole thing is I've talked about how historians build upon each other. We're looking over a decade and a half of historical work in these approaches. Think of it from the ranging of the iPhone 4, 4S, 5, 5S to the iPhone 6. These works keep being built, but they all build upon each other. When you go through the readings, you will see how they build upon each other. But don't forget, there are two different camps. Have fun with the reading, and we will discuss it later.
Quantifiable with what is important. Also, when we ask the question about why the West rules or why Western nations have succeeded, what are we going to do with the answer? Is it for Westerners to congratulate ourselves on a job well done, or to explain away the astonishing inequality in the world as being so deeply rooted in the past as to make any efforts to fix it futile? I'd like to think that by understanding what has made the West more successful in certain ways, we can formulate policies that will lead to a general improvement, at least in those ways, around the world. But we've tried to provide here a series of perspectives on a historical question to emphasize the fact that all history has its perspective. It's common to use mathematical measures to analyze contemporary world problems and attempt to find solutions, and that's a good thing in many ways. But when it comes to history and politics, mathematical formulas also have their perspective. And we need to remember that each of those perspectives is necessarily biased to look at some things and not others. Whether it's Crash Course or your world history textbook, it's important to remember that bias is inherent to the experience of writing and telling the story of history. So when you see a number or a claim of success or failure, stop and ask yourself what sorts of information went into that number or into that conclusion. And just as important, what might have been ignored or missed? Thanks for watching. I'll see you next week.